of interest, did you support the government's 6-month boycott of this programme?
I'm always pleased to come on your programme, so I'll go wherever I'm invited.
Oh, you must have had a very distressing 6 months then when you weren't able to. I just want to play you a clip with our interview with the Health Secretary yesterday, in which we asked him about this issue of MPs' pay. Would it not be the right thing to do that none of you agreed to take a pay rise?
I have never voted on the pay of MPs.
I would love to hear you right now say, I'm not going to take it. Say it.
I think... I know.
Are you prepared to lead right now on Good Morning Britain and put your hand up and say, I will not take a penny? Matt Hancock, right now.
Well, I will answer this question.
That caused the Health Secretary a lot of trouble, that question. Within a few hours, the Prime Minister, through his spokesman, indicated he doesn't support MPs getting a pay rise this year. What is your position?
Yeah, I think that MPs should only be paid in line with what other public service workers are being paid, and if we are paid a pay rise, I will pay mine to charity. That's my position.
Well, that's a very laudable thing.
Which charity would you choose, Grant Shapps?
Well, I get approached for a lot of local charities in my constituency all the time, so I pay it into a charity account and pay it out to them.
Do you accept that at a time when public sector workers, many are facing perhaps a 3-year pay freeze, that the right thing to do then is that the politicians should not be taking a pay rise?
Yeah, and I don't know whether there will be pay freezes. We'll have to wait for the Chancellor on that one. But I do agree with you that actually public sector workers should include MPs in that regard. And I would encourage it's an independent system called IPSA, but I'd encourage them to take that into account for sure. And as I say, I wouldn't accept mine. I pay it into charity. I should say, actually, just for the purposes of balance, that people won't know, but ministers have actually had a 5% pay cut and then a 10-year pay freeze, which is ongoing, which I also support.
Good. Well, that wasn't too hard. Have a word with Matt Hancock and maybe give him some media training.
I'll let him know.
Let's talk to you about what happens with international travel. The lockdown ends on December the 2nd. From then, should we be travelling abroad?
Well, it's always been possible to travel abroad for education or business purposes, but clearly we need to make sure that we carry on pushing down on this virus and being sensible. There won't be a restriction on travelling abroad, but there has been very significant restrictions on travelling somewhere which haven't been in one of these travel corridors, somewhere you could come back from and not have to self-isolate or quarantine for 14 days, as I did in the summer when I put Spain into that quarantine category. And what I'm announcing today, will mean that quarantine period can be cut from 14 days to a minimum of 5.
But that doesn't happen on December the 2nd. That will happen on December the 15th.
That's right, yeah.
Tell us how that works and why you think people will comply with it. Currently, less than 20% of people self-isolate when they are contacted and told to. That's an astonishing low level of compliance. And you are about to say to people, actually, you don't need to quarantine for 2 weeks. You only need to do it for a handful of days, but they must pay themselves for a private test. I mean, why would anybody isolate at all? How are you going to enforce that?
So the Office of National Statistics, the ONS, did a survey, or did study, in fact, of people in the quarantine category, people who've returned from abroad, and actually did show that the majority were carrying out the 14 days quarantine. They should do, because the fines start at £1,000 and they double up, so it can be expensive business. You can get a criminal record for not doing it.
How many people are you checking our quarantine?
Yeah, it is checked. There are now texts that go out. The Public Health England make a series of phone calls, and it has gradually got tighter and tighter. The fines have increased, and actually we're seeing people complying with it.
What's the percentage of people complying with that?
Yeah, so the ONS suggested it was a majority who complied. Nonetheless, I do recognise 14 days is a long time for people to quarantine or self-isolate for. And one of the things that we know is actually if you provide a practical alternative to people, people generally want to do the right thing. You've got to give them the option to be able to do the right thing. And being able to take a test means that you can do that on day 5. And as soon as you have a negative result, you're able to be released. Of course, if it's positive, you then have to carry on.
The incubation period for COVID-19 is not 5 days, is it? But the point about the 14 days was it fully covered any possibility that you might have picked up COVID on the last day, perhaps, of your trip. 5 days and a negative test actually doesn't rule that possibility out, does it?
Yes, I've spent a lot of time discussing with people like the chief medical officer, because you're right. It's a balance between how long the disease takes to incubate, when you may have picked up the disease if you've been away, and of course, as you've rightly pointed out, the extent to which the 14 days is being fully observed. And what we've
you've just told me that the majority of people were observing the 14 days. So why change it to a riskier system where you could increase transmission?
So to give you the figures, the stats on this, what we know is that on a 5-day test, 88%, that will provide 88% of the positive cases. In other words, you're right that if you really wanted to stretch this, you might wait another few days and then do a test, against which, as you've already pointed out, not everybody was carrying out the full 14 days. And what we've ended up calculating is that by providing this option, this alternative in place, we'll get to a system which is just about as safe, but a lot more practical for people.
Hang on.
Generally speaking.
You've just said it's an option. We also know that the individual has to pay for the private test. Private test, as I understand it, is more than £100. Now, how are you going to enforce that added cost onto people? And if they cannot afford to take that private test after they've shelled out for their trip, are you still expecting people to serve the full 14 days in quarantine?
Yes, we are. And on the cost of the test, actually the providers who've come forward for this range between £65 per test and £120. So you're not wrong that it can be over £100. I suspect we'll see that being driven down by the market as more people come into this testing market. We've not said people have to have, viewers may have heard of PCR tests and LAMP tests and lateral flows. We've not said it's got to be a PCR test, which are typically the most expensive ones. What we've said is there's a certain standard, which is very exacting and very high, that they have to reach, but we'll allow the market to develop whichever tests it wants to bring forward in order to fulfil that. And I suspect we'll see the price dropping quite quickly as well.
I spoke to a friend of mine, Alex Macheras. He comes on my show a lot. He's an aviation analyst last night, and said, what would you ask Grant Shapps? And he replied this: Grant Shapps has literally done the opposite of the world as Transport Secretary. He has done nothing. I would ask him what on earth he's been doing for the last 9 months. No airport testing, screening or measures since the pandemic began. None. No temperature checks, no health assessments, no flight restrictions throughout this entire pandemic. No measures to have air travel actually acknowledge we're in a pandemic. The lack of measures have contributed to the worst death toll in Europe, and he detailed what every other country has been doing. So I put it to you, what have you done?
Yeah, I don't agree with that, Piers, as you won't be surprised to hear. And first of all, it's not true that we've done nothing. Of course, we've had these quarantine periods. We've had these travel corridors. So it's not nothing's happened. Also,
have you been testing people? Have you been testing people on arrival?
Well, I was going to say also, it's very tempting to think that if you point one of those temperature guns at someone's head, somehow you've got some magic solution. We know it tells you almost nothing about coronavirus. In fact, you shouldn't be travelling if you're symptomatic anyway. So it's not a very helpful test. We also know that in places like France and Germany and elsewhere, where they instigated tests on day 0, so you came in, you landed at Charles de Gaulle, you were given a test. I speak to my opposite number in France quite a lot, and what they say is actually, unfortunately, that did not work, and we've seen, of course,
we also know that we went through in the first phase of this an extraordinary period where minister after minister appeared on this programme and tried to justify the fact that we didn't make any attempt to close the border or to test people or anything in that first phase whatsoever. In fact, we let 20 million people fly in, it is estimated, many from corona-ravaged countries like Italy, like New York in America, from China and so on. without any testing at all. I think we tested 240-odd people. This was clearly, looking back, you must acknowledge, utter lunacy, wasn't it?
So right at the beginning, I spoke to the chief medical officer and said, shall we shut the borders? To which he said, if you do, it will delay this whole thing by 3 to 5 days, but it's fundamentally already here. It will already spread domestically. An example of a country who did the opposite, as you say, is the United States. And I don't think anybody's going to tell us that the United States response has been
there
triumphant.
There are many countries I could point to. New Zealand, Australia has had an extraordinarily successful pandemic.
So in those
hang on,
countries,
I'm finished yet. You could talk about Taiwan. You could talk about South Korea. Many countries who all deployed, different ways. I'm not saying that they got everything right, but certainly one thing that islands in particular seem to have done well where they've been successful in the pandemic is be very strict at the border. I simply ask you again, you were the Transport Secretary. Why did we not do more at our border when it was so crucial?
Because at the beginning, it wouldn't have made the difference unless you literally closed off before it came here at all. Once it's here, it will spread domestically. And a lot of people wouldn't have been, 3.2 million people returned in that period. Brits wouldn't have been able to come home, so we would have created other problems. And when we make these international comparisons, I think we have to be pretty careful. Australia and New Zealand are very sparsely populated countries. One thing we know about coronavirus is it spreads where people are close together. We have a very different demographic.
And sorry, just to finish this one point,
just to finish this one point. Because of factors like that, and also the international comparisons we made, you mentioned before, Piers, that in Europe we have the worst death toll. Well, that's not the case per size of population, because countries like, I think, Belgium and elsewhere, Spain, Italy, would have worse death tolls. It is a product of, for example, how closely people live together, and there are many other factors involved.
How do you explain that somewhere like South Korea or Taiwan, which are incredibly densely populated, have had such tiny death tolls by comparison to this country? We're going to try and defend our death toll. Explain that to me.
I'd say two things. First of all, they've been subject of other viruses, which have meant that things like wearing face coverings were sort of second nature to them, and they were well ahead of us.
Why weren't we prepared for that? I mean, I remember Matt Hancock standing up in Parliament on January the 23rd and assuring us that the UK was fully prepared for anything like this.
And we were late on face masks.
And in fact, in 2016, we had a whole 3-day pandemic exercise.
Yeah,
so if you're going to cite countries that had better preparation, are you now accepting de facto we were not prepared properly?
Well, I think only a fool would come on your programme or any programme and say that there aren't things that we could and should have done better in the years and decades leading up
just
to
detail.
coronavirus.
Okay, I'm not going to say you're a fool. So just detail for me exactly. It'd be really interesting to me. In the interest of transparency, what did we get wrong?
Okay. Well, for example, this country has not had traditionally a testing capacity. So we went into this crisis with the ability to test 2,000 people a day. That was it. We can now test 538,000 a day, and very soon it's going to go up to over 1 million because there are 2 new mega labs capable of doing 300,000 each, and that's before the lateral flow test. So there are things that, as a country,
PPE? Would you add PPE? The lack of PPE?
Yeah. Well, so actually, again, we didn't have a PPE domestic production industry. Now we have over 70% of our PPE coming from the UK. Is another very good example.
Care
Can
homes?
I just go back
would you add care
point?
homes and the way we handle care homes?
Well, again, I think there'll be plenty of lessons to learn. Can I just answer actually your question before last, going back to your South Koreas and your Taiwans? The other thing about those countries, they have far more ability, authoritarian ability, I suppose, to shut things down. They enforce things like people downloading the app, whereas we ask people voluntarily to do it. 20 million people have done so far. So there is a sort of exchange of freedom in return for some of the responses we've seen as well.
Grant Shapps, we've got to let you go, but I just want to ask you quickly, when you talk about testing, and you've talked about the fact that people will be able to have this test to release them from isolation after 5 days, why don't you provide that for them rather than a family of 4 having to pay a couple of £100? Would that not ensure compliance?
Well, look, fundamentally, I think it's really important that doctors, nurses, teachers, the people we've been making sure we've got enough test capacity can get it. The one thing I haven't wanted to do is to provide that for what is usually a discretionary activity of travel ahead of public service workers who need to be able to get back to work. And that's the reason why.